Hi, I'm Mark, and for my assignment, I will be doing question 4, I think, which is what were the social, political, and military causes and effects of the Indian Rebellion of 1857? So, the Indian Rebellion of 1857 began as a mutiny of sepoys of the East India Company's army on May 10th, 1857, in the small town of Meerut. Soon escalated into other mutinies and civilian rebellions, largely in the Upper Gangetic Plain and central India. It's also known as the Indian Mutiny, the Indian Revolt, the First War of Indian Independence, and the Sepoy Mutiny. It was pretty much a prolonged period of armed uprisings against British occupation. The British presence in India, at that time part of the Mughal Empire, began in the 17th century, when the East India Company acquired its first territory in Bombay. Over the years, the company extended its control and expanded its territory, eventually expelling the French after the Battle of Plassey in 1757, exactly 100 years earlier. The company's army comprised of British officers who commanded the Indian soldiers called sepoys. Before the rebellion, there were over 200,000 sepoys in the army compared to the approximately 50,000 British. The conflict was an accumulative effect of several causes which had been evolving for the past 100 years. These causes arose largely out of the British policy of westernization, which greatly accelerated during the regime of the Marquess of Dalhousie, the young Governor-General. The main causes can be described as political, military, and social in nature. Firstly, I'm going to talk to you about the political causes for the conflict. One of the most serious political causes for the outbreak was the British Doctrine of Lapse, devised by Lord Dalhousie, who was the Governor-General for the East India Company between 1848 to 1856. According to the doctrine, any state or territory under influence of the British East India Company would become annexed if the state's ruler was either manifestly incompetent or died without a direct heir, quoting directly from the doctrine. The doctrine directly countered the long-practiced right of an Indian sovereign without an heir to choose a successor. In addition, the East India Company decided where the potential rulers were competent enough. This doctrine was widely regarded by the Indians as unfair and illegitimate. Several important Indian states, such as Udaipur, Jhansi, Nagpur, and Oudh, fell into British sovereignty due to the doctrine. Thanks to the doctrine, the East India Company added approximately £4 million to its annual revenue. The British also excluded the indigenous population from positions in the high civil and military offices. Therefore, the Indians had no real role in the running of their own country. This, in conjunction with the doctrine of lapse, meant that a number of Indian princes and nobles became useless and couldn't find a place to fit their rank. Now I'm going to talk to you about the social effects. So, along with these political causes, there were also a number of social factors, which included fears about religion and castes. In the years leading up to 1857, English missionary activity was increasing throughout the country. There was much fear among the indigenous population that the English government intended to convert their country to Christianity. This fear became more real when the Hindu law of property was changed by the East India Company, with the intent of facilitating those Hindus converting to Christianity. This meant that those who were converted would be able to heap any inheritance as well as any wealth and status. With the ongoing modernization of India, new infrastructure was being built. This included railways, which one of the most prestigious castes, the Brahmins, viewed in horror. They feared potential religious tainting by coming into contact with untouchables. An untouchable was a member of the lowest class of Hindu group, or a person outside the class system. Coming into contact with untouchables is traditionally held to defile members of higher castes. Another social issue came from the Bengal army, the largest of the three Indian armies. The Bengal army was unique as it mainly recruited its members from high-class Hindus and wealthy Muslims. The majority of the regular soldiers were amongst the Brahmin caste. Many British officers had taken it on themselves to try and convert these sepoys to Christianity. Along with this, in 1856, a new enlistment act was introduced by the East India Company, which, after its construction, made every unit in the Bengal army liable to overseas service. This, in theory, led to the same problem as the railways. It would be nearly impossible on the cramped conditions to avoid religious tainting. After the conflict was resolved, there were many different effects. Politically, there are many effects that the rebellion had. Primarily, Britain realized the problem of a nation being governed by a company. The revolt led to the demise of the British East India Company's rule over India. The Government of India Act, released in August 1858, abolished the company and its former powers. All of the company's previous control was handed to the British monarch. Britain now directly controlled India, with Queen Victoria taking on the title of Empress of India. The previous Governor-General of India was dubbed the Viceroy of India, and essentially became the head of the British administration. And in the future, after India gained its independence, he would become the representative of the monarch. This began the time of the British Raj. Essentially, the Raj was the British dominion over the Indian subcontinent between 1858 and 1947. After the rebellion, the doctrine of lapse, introduced by Lord Dalhousie, was removed, and adopted children were now able to succeed their princely parents. This point in time also marked the end of the Mughal Empire, as the British exiled Emperor Bahadur Shah to Burma. The rebellion also greatly affected the military structure and organization. The previous East India Company army was shut down, and new, regular forces were created. The Indians, now being recruited for the army, consisted of those from the martial castes, such as the Sikhs, Jats, Pathans, and Gurkhas, as these castes had remained loyal during the uprising. The ratio of Indian to British soldiers was also decreased to 3-1, and the Indian troops were prohibited from certain jobs within the army, such as manning artillery. Socially, the rebellion also caused a rise in racial consciousness and extremism, as the British, trying to prevent more violence from occurring, took heavy precautions in making sure that Indians were not placed in high enough positions of power to threaten the British rule again. The immediate effects of the mutiny were the British reprisals. Entire villages suspected of support of the mutineers were massacred. Brutal and humiliating punishments for the mutineers included licking clean blood-stained buildings, eating pork or beef before being publicly hanged, and also being strapped to the front of cannons and being blown to bits. There were many different causes and effects of the Indian Mutiny of 1857. The social, political, and military causes for the uprising were built up over a long period of time, and just needed a trigger, for example the tallow-greased cartridges. The causes primarily included the East India Company attempt at westernization and the public's fear of losing not only their religion, but their way of life. The effects of the uprising predominantly involve the passing of control from India from the East India Company to the Crown. Socially, the indigenous populace was now watched with concern, with the British trying to prevent a recurrence of the violence. Overall, the rebellion changed the attitudes of both India and the British towards Britain's rule of India.